Welcome back. It is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Professor Clemens Sedmak, who joined the Notre Dame faculty in July of 2015 as a visiting professor of Catholic social tradition and community engagement at the Center for Social Concerns and the Keough School of Global Affairs. He is the F.D. Morris Professor of Moral and Social Theology at King's College London and the Director of the Center for Ethics and Poverty Alleviation at the University of Salzburg, where he has served as the F.M. Schmoltz Visiting Professor in Social Ethics since 2009. Professor Sedmak studied philosophy, theology, and social theory and developmental theory at the University of Innsbruck, the ETH Zurich, and at Maryknoll, as well as the University of Linz. After completing doctorates in philosophy, theology, and social theory, he also spent 2 years at Chicago as a research fellow and took up a chair for epistemology and philosophy of religion at the University of Salzburg in 2001, a position he held until 2005, when he came to King's College London as the F.D. Morris Professor of Moral Theology and Social Theology. He has been a visiting professor at the Jomo Kenyatta University in Nairobi, at the Ateneo de Milana University in the Philippines, and at the Universidad Iberoamericana in Mexico City. He has published numerous monographs, including one on the Catholic Magisterium and philosophy, on epistemic resilience, both with Herder Press, as well as a monograph on the foundations of poverty alleviation. His forthcoming book is on the Church of the Poor with Orbis Publishers, and he also has a book on the capacity to be displaced with Brill. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Clemens Sedmak for his lecture entitled The Virtue of Semantic Temperance, the Concept of Human Dignity and Catholic Social Teaching.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the invitation. There is a handout coming round, and Jessica told me that I should present something original. Original means it will be slightly misleading. You have two choices in philosophy. It's either original and misleading, or it's well-known and good and established. And I tried to do something with the topic of temperance and human dignity. And Jessica said I have 55 minutes, so I'll try not to consume all of them, but I might. I will follow the handout. I'm Austrian, as you see from my tie, but the organization of the talk is almost German, so I have those 4 points and the sub-points, and it's easy to follow. In Austria right now, we have many refugees come in, especially from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And there are heated political controversies about what to do with those refugees. And one sentence I think is uncontested, and that's the sentence, refugees are human beings. Refugees are human beings. If you accept this statement, and I know some insane people, but I don't know anyone who would contest this statement. So if you accept this statement that refugees are human beings, there are at least 2 implications. One is, as human beings, refugees are not objects. And that means they cannot be treated as objects and stored as objects or dealt with as if they had no inner lives, emotions, personal stories, hopes, dreams, and desires. Human beings, they are not objects. The other implication is that refugees are human beings, they are not angels. And that means you cannot expect them to behave as if they were moral saints. you cannot expect them to act as if they were superhuman. And what's happening right now in Austria is, and in Germany, that you have hundreds of refugees put in a refugee accommodation where they have nothing to do. And they have to wait for weeks and months. And I have a good life, and this would drive me crazy. These refugees do not have a good life, and we cannot reasonably expect them to be grateful for the way they are being treated for weeks and months in Austria. And that says something about human dignity. Understanding the meaning of what it means to be a human being is connected with understanding the meaning of human dignity, and it does mean not to underestimate or overestimate a human person. Point 1, semantic temperance. Point 2 will be Catholic social teaching documents on the semantics of human dignity. Point 3 will be semantic temperance and the concept of human dignity in search of a balance. Then I will ask you to turn the page, and then we'll talk about 7 issues of human dignity, consone and social ethics according to CST, Catholic social teaching. So my first point, semantic temperance. There are ethical questions connected to semantics, which makes it interesting to connect semantics to virtue ethics. In the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church 124, the text talks about the danger of reducing human dignity to a one-sided meaning. So there is this sense of keep up a well-balanced meaning of the term. In Centesimus Annus from 1991, the social encyclical talks about the need to provide a correct understanding of the dignity of the person. Correct understanding, correct meaning, safeguards the proper semantics. In the same encyclical, we learn that the meaning of human dignity can and should be enriched. It can be deepened. Something can happen to the semantics of the term. These are ethical questions related to semantics. Similarly relevant to this ethics of semantics, I just picked 2 gospel passages. Matthew 12, reminding all of us that on the day of judgment we will have to render account of every useless and careless word. And Matthew 15, reminding us that not what enters the mouth defiles the person, but what comes out of the mouth of the person, which is also a reminder of, well, be careful in the way you use words. British Jesuit James Hunley once observed in a beautiful article that the church is accountable to God for the way she uses language. She is not at liberty to use terms any way she likes. So, first small point under semantic temperance, there are ethical questions connected to semantics. How would I then define or suggest to define semantic temperance? I suggest to define semantic temperance as the virtue to seek and maintain a well-balanced meaning of terms. The virtue to seek and maintain a well-balanced meaning of terms. Which also means that semantic temperance is the virtue that we need to protect the term from distorted, one-sided, extreme, and or reductionist interpretations. So that's semantic temperance in my reading. In order to have a fuller understanding of the term temperance, it's always useful to turn to classics in Christian theology. I pick 2 very briefly. John Cassian, that's 360 to 435, roughly, in his Institutes, Book 5, Section 7, characterizes temperance as self-restraint and as judgment about what is necessary. Which means semantic temperance in connection to human dignity means show self-restraint in the way you use the term, and you should have a judgment about what's essential, what's necessary in the way we use this term. Aquinas dedicates a number of questions to what I call the semantic field of temperance in the second part of the Summa, where he deals with humility, honesty, meekness, sobriety, and chastity in relation to the term temperance. And he sees temperance as moderation that is caused or called for by reason, a kind of moderation which reason causes. So moderation in the use of the term human dignity is what I suggest to think about when we talk about semantic temperance in connection to human dignity. Language influences our soul. Temperance is the virtue that protects us from disturbing effects on the soul, according to Aquinas. If we have an improper or loose way of using the term, this may have an impact on the way we perceive social realities. Humility is an important term in connection to temperance. It means knowing one's place in the universe. Humility is sometimes called a consequence of reason, of realism dictated by reason, knowing where you belong. And an interesting connection for Aquinas is fasting in connection to temperance as guardian of chastity, abstaining from using something in terms of the semantics, abstaining from the overuse of a term, abstaining from the improper mingling of the term when it comes to chastity and purity. And chastity described as preserving freshness. What does it mean to preserve the freshness of the term? And the conference is about this recovering of the theological and philosophical imagination in the light of this. You see that these are just a few thoughts that can be further developed, semantic temperance, but I hope that you see it makes sense to think about the term semantic temperance, because there are ethical questions connected to semantics, because you can define semantic temperance in a, I hope, understandable way, and because the concept of temperance as elaborated by Aquinas and Cassian gives us a lot of food for thought. So far for the term. It's 4:11. Second point, Catholic social teaching documents on the semantics of human dignity. If you look at the documents, and there are many of those, you could at least observe four things. Number one, the meaning of human dignity is inexhaustible. You will not reach a point where you can say, now we fully exhaust the semantics of human dignity. The compendium in 105 talks about an ever deeper and fuller unfolding of the term human dignity. However, this inexhaustible meaning is not without a foundation. There is what I suggest to call a Christmas meaning and an Easter meaning of the term human dignity, connected to Christ sharing the human condition and connected to Christ rising from the dead and thus giving us a new insight into what it means to be the image of God. The compendium in 121 refers to 2 Corinthians and Colossians, talking about Christ as the image of God, and it mentions that Christ enlightens fully and brings to completion the image and likeness of God in man. So the meaning is inexhaustible, but there is a foundation in, let's say, the Christmas and the Easter meaning of the term. A second observation from the documents, human dignity is broken as a reality, and it means that the use of the term will have to honor this brokenness. In 116, the compendium mentions this inner wound in us human beings connected to the fall and original sin, at the root of personal and social divisions which in differing degrees offend the value and dignity of the human person. There is a wound which is present in man's inmost self. And that gives us this challenge of dealing with a term that refers to a broken reality, however, in a Christmas and Easter perspective. And this brokenness will reflect on the term, where we have some of the conundrum we mentioned already this morning between the idea of human dignity and the reality of our human lives. The idea of being created in the image of God and the fall with the promise you will be like God, which is theologically speaking an interesting challenge by the temptator in the creation story, since the human person was already created in the image and likeness of God. Thirdly, one of my favorite passages in the compendium for the social doctrine is 107. It's interesting that one of my favorite passages in Ludwig Wittgenstein's Philosophical Investigations is also 107, but it's not for the record. It's just interesting. So in 107, the compendium tells us that human dignity is what could be called a cardinal principle. The whole of the church social doctrine, in fact, develops from the principle that affirms the inviolable dignity of the human person. Which means this is both a foundational commitment, the commitment to human dignity, is a commitment from which other commitments flow and evolve. And at the same time, it is what could be called a second-order commitment, a commitment to commitments. If you commit to human dignity, you commit to the other principles and values of Catholic social teaching, solidarity, subsidiarity, common good orientation as well. And Evangelii Gaudium reminds us of the fact that if you commit to human dignity, you will ask many inconvenient questions. Inconvenient questions as to the respective violation of human dignity. So, the meaning is inexhaustible, there's brokenness, and human dignity serves in CST as a cardinal principle with this double function as a foundation commitment and a second-order commitment. And fourthly, human dignity in the Catholic social teaching document tradition is first and foremost a gift inviting a response. A gift inviting a response. If you think about Gaudium et Spes 19, that's the last quotation here under 2d, the root reason for human dignity lies in man's call to communion with God. It seems to be the case that human dignity is not so much a property owned by an individual entity, but a statement about a relationship, the relationship between God and the human person. And as a gift, it gives us a different way of reading human identity. There is this beautiful essay by Rowan Williams on being creatures, where he reflects on the question, what does it mean to see ourselves as creatures, as entities that have been created, willed by God, depending on God, in relationship with God. And he says, well, it means, among other things, that our identity is not primarily achieved, construed, negotiated, but received. It is a gift. And as we all know from the sociology of gifts, if you get something as a gift, it comes with a price tag and with expectations. If you give a book to a person, you expect the person, at least implicitly, to read the book. That's why so many things can go deeply wrong with giving. If you give the wrong book to the wrong person, right? There are these books, How to Live with Failures, for instance. If you give a book with this title to persons you know, it can be dangerous. Because gifts elicit a response. And in connection to human dignity, there is a threefold response. To oneself, self-respect. So responding to the gift of human dignity gives you a sense of, I owe something to myself, self-respect. A response to the other person, acknowledging the gift of human dignity in others, generates certain commitments in the way I deal with others, a second-person perspective of some sort. And thirdly, a response to God, as mentioned in Centesimus Annus 13. Human dignity invites us to respond to God, who established a relationship that is characterized by our human dignity. And the idea of responding and giving is, I find, beautifully expressed in Caritas in Veritate 57. The person is a subject who is always capable of giving something to others. A person is a subject who is always capable of giving something to others. So whoever it is part of our human dignity that we can give something to others. It is part of the recognition of the human dignity of others to see the other person as someone capable of giving something. No matter how poor, no matter how disabled, no matter how young, how sick, how elderly, etc. So that's the fourth idea. So human dignity, probably more of a term characterizing a relationship than a term characterizing a property that we carry around with us. So that's the second point. Catholic social teaching documents on the semantics of human dignity. After having established some ethical connections with semantics, I try to say that in CST the meaning of human dignity is inexhaustible but well-founded or grounded. There is a brokenness that we have to grapple with. It serves as a cardinal principle and has to be seen primarily as a gift. Now, if I take those two things together, semantic temperance idea and CST documents on human dignity, it will invite me to think about the balance. I defined in 1b semantic temperance as the virtue to seek and maintain a well-balanced meaning of terms. The virtue to seek and maintain a well-balanced meaning of terms. And I see this balance challenged in at least 4 ways. The first way is to negotiate the balance between the analyzable and tangible meaning of the term on the one hand and the mystery that remains on the other hand. If we have a foundation for the meaning of human dignity in CST, then we can say a lot about the term. And there are many conferences about the term, and many books and many articles. We can make many words. And that's a good sign and a bad sign. But it's also a good sign. Let's say it's a good sign. So we can't disagree about human dignity, which is also a good sign. So there is meaning where we can say, well, this is not about human dignity, this is about something else, and it's a clear case. On the other hand, if human dignity is primarily a statement or a term to be used to characterize a relationship between humans and God, there is this mystery dimension. And if there is a mystery dimension, it means that we cannot fully exhaust the meaning, and the famous Fourth Lateran Council may be relevant for human dignity as well. As you know, the Fourth Lateran Council, famously quoted by Karl Rahner in his very last theological talk. In March 1984, there was this conference on the occasion of his 80th birthday. Karl Rahner gave a talk entitled Experiences of a Catholic Theologian. And the first experience he mentioned, and you know Karl Rahner, at least from his writings, he was not a person to share much about his inner turmoils. So he talked about theological experiences. And the first experience he mentioned was, do we take the analogical nature of theological statements seriously? And he uses this Denzinger 806 quotation from the Fourth Lateran Council from 1215. Between creature and creator, there cannot be such a similarity that there is not at the same time a larger dissimilarity. And sometimes this is translated into whatever we say about God is more dissimilar to God than similar. But that's a theological conversation in its own. It just means that there is a mystery dimension that our language cannot fully control. And that's one of these challenges to semantic temperance when it comes to human dignity. On the one hand, we want to have a tangible meaning, and on the other hand, we want to respect the mystery dimension. A second challenge to semantic temperance in connection to human dignity is the double function of the term. On the one hand, human dignity exalts the human person, elevates the human person, and says something beautiful and powerful about us human beings being created in the likeness and image of God. But at the same time, it's also a humbling term telling us you are only human beings and you are not gods. You are only human beings and you are not gods. That's why I mentioned here just human dignity. It's just human dignity. It's not divine dignity. It's just human dignity, but in a double sense of the word just human dignity. You probably know Avishai Margalit's reservation towards a vertical justification of human dignity, because he doesn't like the idea of us needing a God to have human dignity as human beings. And he prefers what he calls a horizontal justification of human dignity. And my response to Avishai Margalit would be, or actually was, that the very fact that we are committed to seeing ourselves as creatures ensures that we do not see ourselves as gods. So idolatry is precluded by this reading of human dignity. So the challenge here is to have temperance or a balance between exaltation and humility, between elevating the human person and by curbing it, so to speak. Just think of day 6 of the creation story. there are at least two messages on day 6 of the creation story. Number one, it didn't take God a whole day to create the human person. And number two, God did more on that day than just create the human person. So it's human dignity, which is also a humbling term. The third challenge with semantic temperance in connection with human dignity is the well-rounded balance of examples. I mentioned Ludwig Wittgenstein. The first mention was beside the point, but the second mention is to the point. In his Philosophical Investigations 593, Wittgenstein says that many philosophical diseases have their cause in a one-sided diet of examples. A one-sided diet of examples. You nourish your thinking with only one kind of paradigms. And that's a danger with the term human dignity. Avishai Margalit coined the term moral kitsch. And he used Milan Kundera's definition of kitsch, which is probably known to you. Milan Kundera characterizes kitsch as 2 tears are running down your cheek. The first tear says, those children playing out there are cute. And the second tear says, I must be so cute that I find those kids cute. And the second tier constitutes kitsch. And Avishai Margalit says he went to the museum in Auschwitz in a concentration camp, and he saw people being deeply moved by what they saw there. But they were also deeply moved by the fact that they were deeply moved. And they would say to themselves, after all, I'm not a bad person, I'm deeply moved by what I see here. And he says, that's moral kitsch. And he also says, as an Israeli philosopher, in the Hebrew Bible, we often hear about the orphan and the widow. And there's nothing wrong talking about the orphan and the widow, but we mustn't stop there. We must not stop there, our human dignity discourse, otherwise we fall into the trap of what he calls moral kitsch. So there is not only the challenge of the human dignity of, let's say, the unborn and the disabled and the elderly. There's also the challenge of the human dignity of the murderer and the rapist. And that's part of this search of a balance, trying to have semantic temperance in understanding the term. There's always the temptation in moral philosophy to use extreme examples. And semantic temperance would caution us to do so. So that's a third challenge, finding a balance or semantic temperance in connection to human dignity. A fourth challenge I see in the negotiation between interpretative freedom on the one hand and hermeneutical limits on the other hand. Centesimus Annus 34 says that human dignity is prior to any exchange of goods, meaning there is something that characterizes the human condition that is not open to change, that cannot be manipulated. And I would suggest to compare that to the Catholic notion of private property in some analogy. And the analogy would be, there is an idea of a right to private property in the Catholic social tradition, but there is never an absolute right to your own private property. You do not fully own your private property. If you have in superabundance and there is dire need, you have an obligation to share, an obligation. And that means what you own as your private possessions is not fully yours. Similarly, human dignity is not a term that is open to all kinds of negotiations and stipulations according to Catholic social teaching. There is something in us that I cannot, even respecting my autonomy, fully define. You may know the case of Jeffrey Spector. 2 years ago, Jeffrey Spector, 1 year ago, Jeffrey Spector, a British gentleman, was diagnosed with a degenerative disease at the age of 57, and he was still in the full possession of his bodily functions and in the full possession of his mental capacities, and he decided to have a Last Supper, a literal Last Supper in Zurich. So he went with his friends and family to Switzerland and then had a Last Supper with his friends and family. And on the following morning he checked in the Dignities clinic in Zurich and drank a lethal liquid and died. And there were all these comments in the British newspapers praising Jeffrey Spector for this self-respect and this expression of human dignity. This expression of human dignity. And there was ample use of the term human dignity. And I'm not trying to do any Jeffrey Spector bashing here. I'm just trying to say Catholics would say it's not up to the individual person to define human dignity any way he or she likes. As a human being, I have something within me that I do not control, neither linguistically nor operationally. And that's this fourth challenge, interpretative freedom versus hermeneutical limits. So this is the third point. If you take this idea of semantic temperance and apply it to Catholic social teaching documents, you would see those challenges of negotiating a balance between meaning and mystery, between exaltation and humbling or humility, between the well-rounded balance of examples that gives you the full spectrum rather than a reductionist account, and between interpretative freedom and hermeneutical limits. If you are still with me, you could turn the page. And point 4 talks about what I suggest to call a dignity consonant social ethics. Quadragesimo Anno from 1931 talks about a life or a society consonant with human dignity. And Semantic 35 talks about something being consistent with the dignity of the human person, development, consistent. I like the term consonant, a dignity consonant social ethics. Would be a kind of ethics that practices or encourages practices that inform the meaning of the term human dignity. And if you look at the documents of Catholic social teaching in the light of this idea, dignity consonant social ethics, certain points come to mind. I mention 7, which is a lot, but it's only 431. I mentioned 7. There cannot be, according to the Compendium 132, a just society without the recognition of transcendent dignity. If you do not recognize human dignity, this poisons human society. And poison is a very strong image. It talks about it will get worse and worse and worse. It will enter the very roots of society. It will undermine the value fabric. So this is a conditio sine qua non, the recognition of the transcendent dignity of the human person. That is a source of normativity, supporting people, enabling people to live with dignity, to live lives worthy of their human dignity. And in connection to that, derivative dignities, as you might call it, the dignities of institutions, such as the dignity of marriage, the dignity of family, or the dignity of work. So, conditio sine qua non, no just society without the recognition of transcendent dignity, which also serves as a yardstick or criterion for the justice of society. Secondly, a dignity consonant social ethics would respect the primacy of the person. And the primacy of the person means Catholic social teaching does not follow the logic of Caiaphas, better one person dies and the entire people perishes. It does not. Every single person counts. And the social order, and Margit Pfeil referred to that this morning, has to serve the person rather than the other way around. And there is also, if you look at the quotation from Parsimentaris, a right to responsibility. The primacy of the person also means, human dignity means people have a right to contribute, a right to give, a right to embrace responsibilities. Thirdly, Catholic social teaching is not only harmless and painless. There are some passages that talk about the incomparability of dignity and consonant ethics with certain kinds of inequalities. Pope Benedict in Caritas in Veritate writes, the dignity of the individual and the demands of justice require that economic choices do not cause disparities in wealth to increase in an excessive and morally unacceptable manner. And the Compendium in 144 reminds us that God shows no partiality and created human beings as equals. So this may be a sword in the flesh, that certain types of inequality are not compatible with dignity consonant social ethics. And that may come down to questions about remuneration policies, legal frameworks, and there are at least 2 passages I know of that mention inequality as the root of social ills of any kind. Pope Francis quite prominently so in Evangelii Gaudium. So that's a thorn in the flesh where human dignity, concern, and social ethics may be inconvenient in asking the above-mentioned inconvenient questions. 4th observation, dignity, concern, and social ethics will be sensitive to violations of human dignity because human dignity can be damaged. One document, Centesimus Annus, reminds us of the role of World War II in the Church's discourse on human dignity. And you see some examples of subhuman living conditions incompatible with dignity, concern, and lives on a material level, but also on an immaterial level as materialistic, atheistic, mechanistic philosophies or magical beliefs. Dignity, concern, and social ethics would give special attention to the most vulnerable. And one question I suggest in this connection is the question, whom have we forgotten? Whom have we forgotten? There are many people we don't even know that we forgot because we have completely forgotten them. And human dignity will ask this question, whom have we forgotten? Just this morning we talked about Jesus in the temple and his parents starting to miss Jesus on the 3rd day. That's interesting. I would miss my child on the 1st day, I guess. But sorry, this is inconvenient. Not criticizing the Holy Family here. But it's this, whom have we forgotten? Oh, our children. Anyway. And of course, dignity, concern, and social ethics would be very sensitive to crucial areas such as sexuality. The way sexuality is being expressed and lived in a society says a lot about the dignity, consonance of the social practices. And one indication of violation, according to Centesimus Annus, is humiliation. So a good question to ask if we want to have an understanding of dignity, concern, and social ethics is, where are entry points for humiliation? Where are entry points for humiliation that would violate a person's self-respect and violate the self-understanding of us as being recipients of a gift and givers? A 5th observation, Rerum Novarum, as you know, the first social encyclical, talks about the soul as the main addressee of our discourse on human dignity. It is the soul which is made after the image and the likeness of God. And 40 years later, Catechism Anno talks about the ruin of souls, meaning a dignity, concern, and social ethics will pay special attention to the human soul. And the idea of human beings are ensouled beings. And if there is a person in a wake coma, the person has a soul that makes a difference. And I want my children to be taught by teachers who believe in the idea of a soul. And it also means that a dignity, concern, and social ethics would ask the questions that we find in early Christian writings. What does the human soul need in order to be properly nourished? And some suggestions would be the soul needs beauty, the soul needs tranquility, the soul needs friendship. A dignity, concern, and social ethics would respect those conditions that would nourish the human soul. Observation number 6, a dignity, concern, and social ethics would try to build corporations and alliances to defend human dignity. So the church is invited to build bridges towards maybe even unusual partners to defend human dignity. And there are some unusual alliances defending workers' rights, for instance, when unions in the Catholic Church side with one another, defending human life when leaders of Islam and leaders of the Catholic Church side with one another. So Pope Francis invites us to see a dignity, concern, and social ethics as bridge building. And finally, for me, one of the most important points, a dignity, concern, and social ethics will respect the idea of there needs to be a sense of human dignity and awareness of human dignity. Gaudium et Spes talks about this keen sense of human dignity. Centesimus Annus talks about the need for an awareness of human dignity. And that's an interesting idea. John Rawls, in his theory of justice, talks about the importance of a sense of justice. We have to share a sense of justice in order to have a just society. And a sense of justice is not something you can impose on people through legislative means. It goes beyond and beneath that. there has to be a sense. And that means for me that human dignity has the quality of a perceptual concept. It will shape the way we perceive social realities. The way we perceive social realities, this sense of human dignity. You find lovingly handwritten by me or hand-typed on your handout a quotation from Coetzee's disturbing novel Waiting for the Barbarians. It's a scene where the narrator observes cruelty of a mob that tortures 4 captured prisoners, and then one of the soldiers takes up a hammer to basically finish those 4 prisoners. And the narrator says, "Not with that, not with a hammer, I shout. The hammer lies cradled in the colonel's folded arms. You would not use a hammer on a beast, not on a beast. In a terrible surge of rage, I turn on the sergeant and hurl him from me. Godlike strength is mine. In a minute it will pass. Let me use it well while it lasts. Look, I shout. I point to the 4 prisoners who lie docilely on the earth, their lips to the pole, their hands clasped to their faces like monkeys' paws, oblivious of the hammer, ignorant of what's going on behind them. Look, I shout. We are the great miracle of creation. But from some blows this miraculous body cannot repair itself. How? Words fail me. Look at this man, I recommence. Man. And by man he means these are human beings. And if you see that, you will not do certain things. If you perceive these beings as human beings, you will not do certain things. That's on a perceptual level, beyond arguments and not something that can be easily argued for. Which brings me at 4:41 to my concluding remark after a brief summary. So, the journey was the following. In my first point, I reflected on the term semantic temperance, thinking about connections between ethics and semantics, defining semantic temperance as the virtue to seek and maintain a well-balanced meaning of terms, trying to get some insights for further discussion from the discussions on temperance in Cassian and Aquinas. In the second point, I looked at 4 features of human dignity according to Catholic social teaching documents: the inexhaustibility but groundedness of meaning, the brokenness of the reality behind it, and thus the brokenness of the term. Human dignity as a cardinal principle, both a foundation and a second-order commitment, and human dignity as a gift inviting a response, more a relational term than a property term. Thirdly, I try to connect those two, the balance for the concept of human dignity with 4 challenges: negotiate the balance between meaning and mystery, the balance between exaltation and humility, the balance between the examples we use, and the balance between freedom and hermeneutical limits. And then I tried to show some points of reference for a dignity consonant social ethics in the tradition of Catholic social teaching. The litmus test of the justice of society is the respect for transcendent dignity. And that would mean you don't do certain things. If you recognize a person as a person, certain things are non-negotiable. In moral philosophy, we sometimes distinguish 2 types of arriving at moral decision. One type is you have options and you try to identify the most appropriate options, looking for arguments and counter-arguments. And that's useful and helpful, and politicians do it all the time. When we buy a new car or a previously owned new car, that's what we do. What are our options? And then you argue for a good option. However, there's a second way of arriving at moral judgments, and that's the way where you say, that's non-negotiable, the rest will follow. I'll give you 2 examples. I was on an advisory board of the Austrian Minister of Finance in 2009 when we had the Austrian version of the bank crash. And the ministry decided that the banks must be saved. That's non-negotiable. And all the rest will fall into place and follow. All the debts and all the legislation, etc. Second example, if our child needs medical treatment, that's non-negotiable. And if we have to sell our house, sell our car, that's what we do. This is non-negotiable. That's not one option among others. It's non-negotiable. And what Catholic social teaching does, it reminds us of respecting the dignity of the human person is non-negotiable. It's not an option where you have other options or alternatives. This is non-negotiable, and the rest will have to follow, even if the costs are very, very high. And some of the costs may be high. Think of inequality, think of entry points for violation in those special areas, or looking at the most vulnerable. The idea of preserving the soul, building bridges, and preserving the sense of human dignity as a perceptual concept. Concluding remark. One of the tasks of this conference, I think that's what I understood, was to think about the value and function of the term human dignity. What gets lost if we don't have human dignity as a term any longer? And one suggestion I could make in the light of what I tried to say before was the term human dignity could serve as a basis for dignity therapy for an entire society affected by moral Alzheimer's disease. What do I mean by moral Alzheimer's disease? Alzheimer's disease is, as you know, a matter of mental decline, forgetfulness, and these people are not malicious, even though they sometimes behave aggressively, and it's not easy to have a parent suffering from Alzheimer's disease. But they are, in a sense, not malicious people. More and more, I find myself thinking about the shifting landscape of moral perceptions in our society. And more, I find myself in a position where I have to find arguments for something which I thought need not be argued for. In ethics, we sometimes have the question, why should I not set my children on fire and watch them burn? Why should I not do that? I don't have many good arguments. A lawyer may have good arguments. But you would say, if you want an argument from me, something is deeply, deeply wrong with you, because that's something that is beyond arguments. That's on a perceptual level. You just don't do that. A little bit like Kutzi's quotation, these are human beings. You don't use a hammer on human beings. And moral Alzheimer's means to me, there are people who don't see moral issues. Pope Francis, in his Easter messages, try to awaken Europe by telling them, wake up from the slumber of indifference. These are human beings drowning in the Mediterranean Sea. And you cannot simply say, well, this has nothing to do with me. And these are not malicious people who say that. It has nothing to do with my life. I know people, and these are not malicious people, who would say, let them drown. It's better for them. And that's one indication of what I think can be called moral Alzheimer's disease. And as you may know, dignity therapy was developed by Harvey Kochinoff and others after 2005. And it asks people in need of care about their life history, their values, their hopes for others, and their messages that they want to give to their children or grandchildren. And they ask these questions, which enhances the sense of self-respect in those people, and the answers would be made known to the personnel in the nursing home, for instance, and would make it easier for the personnel, the nurses, to see these are human beings. They may suffer from Alzheimer's disease at an advanced stage, but these are human beings. So I think dignity therapy as a reminder, these are human beings, can be applied to a social or societal level, and that's where we need the term human dignity. Thank you.
The floor is open for questions.
Sure.
You mentioned that dignity was non-negotiable. I'd like to bring some complication to that. Aren't there other values and other principles that at times may be in tension or contradiction with dignity? I'm thinking of, for instance, I volunteer in a local nonprofit. We help people that are getting their utilities cut off. We make them jump through a lot of hoops. Sometimes I think we might be violating their dignity because there's regulations, there's sometimes we give them a runaround. We end up, in essence, kind of distinguishing between the deserving and the non-deserving, which if you talk to poverty scholars, that's a no-no, but I think it's inevitable. So that's just one example. I think at other times, too, think of the value of love. How do you show love to people? Even in a situation like that, or sometimes, I know the term tough love can be abused or overused, but at times, even with children, or even in situations, you need to show tough love, and you think you're violating your dignity. So I guess my question is, are there things we have to balance with that? Are there other values? Are there other distinctions we need to make in these contexts, in real life contexts where it really gets complicated?
Maybe four things. What I should have said, and I hope I did say that, is the respect for the transcendent dignity of the human person is non-negotiable. The respect for the transcendent dignity of the human person is non-negotiable. And that may make a difference in terms of respecting human dignity and or seeing human dignity as non-negotiable and the respect for as non-negotiable. Secondly, I think it's an underestimated challenge in Catholic social teaching debates to look into the value conflicts within CST. That's underestimated, and I think there are some robust tensions there. For example, option for the poor is sometimes at odds with a common good orientation, and the idea that if you pursue an option for the poor, you will contribute to the common good does not always respond to our life realities. Or option for the poor presents this option as the group of the poor is harmonious and homogeneous. And as you know, there are competitive segments of poor people and they fight with one another. And right now in Austria, you have poor Austrians begging Romanians and Syrian refugees. And they are all poor and they fight with each other about the competitive goods. So that's my second point, and I think you're on to something very important here, value conflicts within CST. And also the idea of the common good is being the common good of family, being harmoniously reconcilable with the common good of a community, the common good of a state, the common good of the global level seems to be challenging. So much so that the common good of Notre Dame may be at odds with the common good of South Bend and vice versa, just in brackets. So that's my second point. I think that's a very important question to pursue further, value questions within or conflicts within CST, and there's not much literature on that. My third point would say human dignity would help to shape the responses. In the CST tradition, human dignity is not one principle next to others. It's the foundational principle that might help us to solve value conflicts between common good orientation, subsidiarity, and option for the poor. And respecting human beings as human beings and persons, I think, should be non-negotiable. And my fourth point, one way of showing that respect may be precisely tough love. Maybe precisely the idea of you expect something from the other person. And CST documents are full of this idea. There's a right to responsibility. They're not only rights, they're also duties. And every single person is invited to pursue the option for the poor, including the poor themselves. And I think that's where tough love, meaning you expect the person to give something as an expression of respecting the dignity of the person, may come in quite handy. And I think from a poverty research perspective, yes, you do have those painful questions of opportunity costs. Screening, most measures have screening procedures, which means that most measures are beneficial to those who need the measure least. In terms of, if you have an unemployment reintegration project, you will have a screening, and those who are hopeless cases will be screened out because the NGO needs to have the promising cases in the situation. And this is this tough question of opportunity costs. And I think the societal responsibility would be to say yes to prudent poverty alleviation measures without allowing certain people to fall through all the safety nets. So there must be a minimum decency ensured. And Margalit in his 1996 book famously said, we may not be able to construe a just society, the bar is too high, but we should and must be able to construe a decent society that does not humiliate human beings. And that's, I think, where my answer would be. Respecting the transcendent dignity of the human person would help us identify entry points for humiliation, and it may ease our strain for thinking that we have to help everybody to know that there is yet another life to come. I personally find this quite consoling, that we don't have to squeeze everything out of this life in the light of our hope in a life yet to come.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that was very instructive. You've given what I found a convincing account of what a dignity-consonant social ethics would look like. And I'm wondering if you can expand on that a little bit to talk about situations where there's been harm or violations to human dignity. How can dignity be rehabilitated, restored? What is the correct ethic there? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think you all understood the language game I was playing. I was not talking about my own personal opinion, but about Catholic social teaching, which is very close to my personal opinion. But so the dignity consonant social ethics developed in the light of CST documents, and you ask basically two questions. One, instances of violation, and under D, I mentioned subhuman living conditions, arbitrary imprisonment, deportation, slavery, prostitution. From Government Space 27 as very clear indications. This is where what CST thinks is human dignity is violated. But also inequality. If you have a bizarre gap between those on top and those at the bottom, that is a violation of human dignity by those standards. You can break it down also to individual situation of people being exploited. And I did some research into refugee stories from Syrian refugees making it to Germany and Austria. And it's unbelievable what some people had to go through. How many, not only moral sacrifices, but also personal damages they had to endure getting to safe grounds. They saw their children drown. They saw their spouses being thrown into the sea, etc., etc. And these are clear violations of what we talk about here. There are also white-collar violations of human dignity. I once heard an interview of a Deutsche Bank manager, quite high up in the hierarchy, and she said, "I'm a mass murderer." And she was, businesswoman, very well educated, nicely clothed, and she said, "I'm a mass murderer because I engage in those food price speculations, and I just know because of that food prices went up and hundreds of thousands of people had problems footing their living costs and even getting into famine situations." These are white-collar violations of human dignity. And Pope Francis is quite strong reminding us of that. And the inequality discourse may be quite inconvenient for certain segments of society. What to do about that? Not tolerate that on the micro level. And I'm interested in the theological concept of hell, because it says a lot about social ethics and our values. And one concept of hell is the idea of there is no eye contact. Maybe you know the alphabetical sayings of Tegma Paton, early 5th century, a collection of the wisdom of desert mothers and fathers. And Abbas Macarius had a vision of hell. And he described hell as a place where people are bound back to back without any eye contact. That's hell. And hell is obviously a theological way of speaking about violation of the transcendent dignity of the human person. And we can create hell on earth vis-à-vis our children, vis-à-vis our students. And that's the first thing, don't let this happen. Second thing is identify and speak about it. And the third thing is, as Pope Francis said, build alliances and cooperation to minimize the probability that this is accepted as something which is in the moral Alzheimer's discourse, something that we can live with. Many people say that the greatest risk or the greatest threat to moral life is not the immoral life, but the morally indifferent life. And so fighting moral indifference, making people see problems, using human dignity as a perceptual concept, as something that should change our perceptions, would be my way of answering this question. That was a decent enough discussion, right?
We have come to the end of the hour, and before we do Catholic Social Teaching and International Human Rights Law is launching a website that puts together human rights discourse and Catholic social teaching. This is done through the Keough School, the Center for Civil and Human Rights, and we'll be hearing from Paolo tomorrow, who's associated with that center, and the Center for Digital Scholarship. These are available in the atrium if you would like to take a look. Friends, please join me in